Hallo zusammen! Zum Abschluss unserer Staffel Stay Forever Spielt zum Textadventure Savoir-Faire sprechen wir nun mit der Autorin des Spiels, mit Emily Short. Wer von euch die Staffel gehört hat, der weiß, dass Gunnar und ich sehr viel Freude mit Savoir-Faire hatten, insbesondere mit der Art der Erzählung und dem Schreibstil. Und dass wir dafür stellenweise recht ratlos vor der zentralen Spielmechanik standen, nämlich dem Verbinden von Gegenständen. Und beides diskutieren wir jetzt natürlich gleich mit Emily, aber wir erfahren von ihr auch viel Kontext darüber, wie und warum das Spiel eigentlich entstanden ist und was sie heute, als mittlerweile ja sehr erfahrene Spieldesignerin, über Savoir-Faire denkt. Das Interview ist auf Englisch, aber wie gewohnt gibt es am Ende eine deutschsprachige Zusammenfassung von uns. Über die Kapitelmarken könnt ihr direkt dorthin springen, wenn ihr das möchtet. Und nun viel Spaß mit unserem Gespräch mit Emily Short.
Another visitor. Stay a while. Stay forever.
Ein Podcast über alte Spiele von zwei alten Männern. Stay Forever mit Gunnar Lott und Christian Schmidt.
With us today is Emily Short, author of the game Savoir-Faire, but that's just one work in a much larger portfolio. Emily has authored and designed multiple innovative and influential interactive fiction games, and I'm sure we'll brush on some of them in our conversation today. She worked on several titles at Failbetter Games, primarily on Fallen London. She's an accomplished writer, speaker, manager, and not least someone with extensive technical expertise. I guess as you have to be when you're writing interactive fiction, since that essentially means programming interactive fiction. Emily, we are honored to have you on our show today.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with something very easy, I hope. Just to clarify a point that came up in our podcast on Savoir-Faire, we're talking to you in the UK right now. You're living and working there.
Yes.
But you're originally from the United States, right?
Yes, as is probably also obvious from my accent. Yes.
Can you give us a quick overview of your background, your time before you became involved with interactive fiction?
Right. Well, I mean, in some sense, the time before I became involved with interactive fiction was very short because I was playing my first text adventures as a kid in sort of at the age of 5 or 6. So it was kind of always a thing that I enjoyed. I was playing Infocom games and Scott Adams games on computers and tried to teach myself a little bit of basic programming because I also wanted to build my own, obviously. But as a kid and as a teenager, I didn't really have the skill set to do that. And I really had no idea of games being my career. That just didn't seem like a viable possibility at the time. So I went into classics, academia, and started working on a PhD in that field. And at the same time, kind of found out, oh, there's a whole community of people who have freeware tools for interactive fiction and who are sort of still building these games and talking about them. And I became very involved with that as a hobby. So basically, at the time that I wrote Savoir-Faire, I was supposedly working on my PhD program, actually writing a lot of interactive fiction that my advisor didn't know about. So that was the context in which this was created.
Your interest in interactive fiction was rekindled by that community and the tools which were available.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had always been interested in what I could do in that space, but I really, it was obvious to me even kind of in the late 90s, this is no longer a commercial thing at all. And I had no idea that there were a bunch of people who were still building and talking about these games. So a friend of mine in college let me know, oh, hey, this exists. And I played Curses, which is Graham Nelson's game in Inform. And I was kind of off to the races at that point. And so during the years leading up to releasing Savoir-Faire, I was teaching myself Inform. I was getting in contact with that community and actually talking to them more and more online. I released the previous game, Galatea. And all of that was kind of, this is an artistic space in which I can do things that I find really compelling, but it's a whole separate thing from my actual job as I saw it at the time.
I played Galatea when it came out and replayed it recently in order to prepare it. It still feels quite fresh, even in these times of AI and everything. Still feels like a unique experience. And we would love to hear you describe the game in your own words.
Sure. So Galatea is a game based in the myth of Pygmalion and Galatea. You've got a statue that has been created by somebody and brought to life. And it's designed in terms of play experience as a conversation with this statue. So your entire experience is asking her, telling her about subject matter, or potentially you can interact with her a little bit physically, but mostly it's exploring things that she brings up and you decide what you want to pursue and talk to her about more. At the time that I was writing it, I was working within a community environment where characters in text adventure games, in interactive fiction, tended to be very much a means to an end, right? Like you would have a guard who was in the way of you going someplace that you would need to bring them a bribe, or you'd have characters that could answer questions about really specific things, but those things were puzzle related. And if you ask them the same question again, they'd give you the same answer back. And so there was a lot there where I just felt like these representations of characters really don't have any significant degree of interiority. They don't have a lot of drama associated with them. If I treat them poorly, they're not really going to remember that beyond certain basic things. And to be fair, there had been a handful of games in the hobbyist community that were working on exceptions to that. But I felt like there was still a huge amount of room to explore the idea of a character where, like, if you ask her questions repeatedly, she will notice, she will say different things. Like, if you ask her the same thing over and over, she will maybe get annoyed that you're doing that. Somebody who might have a degree of sensitivity about certain topics and not like to be asked about them, or might have an emotional reaction. A character where it might matter, like, how much of your own backstory as a protagonist you're willing to share with her. So that was really what I was trying to explore with that piece.
The tools that you mentioned that were in use back then in that community, they had been built primarily to replicate the classic text adventure experience.
Yes.
And character interaction and conversations were not a strong side of this classic experience. Probably one of the reasons why you were so keen on exploring that. But was that even possible with the tools, or did you have to adjust them in some way?
I mean, obviously it was possible since we did that, but there was a lot that went into sort of trying to figure out how to model the conversational space. So the existing tools, so I was working in Inform. For full disclosure, the reason I now live in the UK is that I married the creator of Inform and moved to his country. So that's like just background information there that may be relevant. But at the point I was writing Galatea or Savoir-Faire, like, I didn't know him at that point. I just had been playing his games and working with the tool. That tool at the time was really set up for modeling relationships between objects. Like, we've got a room and there's certain things in the room, and you might have a container or a supporter that also has things in or on it. And so I was trying to build the conversation by analogy with that model. And so I, on a sort of code level, you've got these large conversation topics that actually nest smaller topics inside them. And that was part of how I was thinking about representing, like, oh, you can't get to asking about this thing until you've heard it mentioned already. And so I can do that by nesting these concepts and then having it become possible to see through them. It was a very weird kind of hacky way of expressing this idea. But what the tool supports the idea that if you can see an object, you can refer to the object, and then the system will understand, right? So a lot was then like, how do I control what concept objects are visible to the player? And then that will allow me to control what they're allowed to refer to. And there was a bunch of other stuff I was doing as well, like I'd taken some linguistics classes in college, and one of the things that really stuck with me there was some of the maxims of understanding what somebody means. Like Grice's maxim of relevance is like, if I say something, it has some connection to what's gone before it. And that becomes relevant in conversation handling in the sense that if the player uses a term that could refer to multiple different things in the game's model, I should assume that the player is referring to the thing that's most like what we just mentioned. So that was another kind of piece of under the hood disambiguation. I doubt that most players notice any of that or care, but to me, as like the sort of technical side of creation, I was really interested in that kind of problem. So yeah.
The community is relatively small and must have been back in the early 2000s as well. But the game caused quite a splash. So how did that feel? Were you suddenly known by everyone in interactive fiction?
Well, I mean, it was, when we're talking, like, everyone in interactive fiction, like, the involved members of the news group were probably, I was thinking on the scale of, like, 50 to 100 people, really. Honestly, I already knew a lot of those people socially because I had been involved in the news group. I had been talking to people. It wasn't like I was a person that nobody had ever heard of. There was even, like, a mud-style interaction space which was basically just a chat room that people would hang out and talk about interactive fiction. So it was not a thing where it's sort of like I popped up and nobody had heard of me before, but it was nonetheless a really striking experience because I hadn't released anything before and I had no expectation of it being received quite the way that it was. So it was entered in, it wasn't a sort of standard competition. It was a thing called the IF Art Show, which was specifically designed for sort of non-typical games, like things that were like they could be in a portrait category, which is what I used for Galatea, or a landscape category. So there was kind of this idea of like, this is a representational art piece, but the organizer had gotten well-known people from the IF community to volunteer to be the judging panel. And what that meant was that they would write reviews of all of the pieces that were submitted. And then as now, the currency of these kinds of communities really is reviews. Like you want as much feedback, analysis, all that kind of stuff as possible. So I still remember sort of like getting up on the day that the reviews came out for Galatea online. And for some reason, I was home with my family and we were going on a car trip somewhere. And so I had downloaded this stuff to my laptop and was like reading it on the laptop in the car. And I was just blown away that how much attention and care had been given in the reviews, and also that it apparently had felt so successful to people. So yeah, I mean, that was the lovely experience, but also kind of not really representative of what releasing games is like in general. So
how did you get from Galatea to Savoir-Faire?
Okay, so in terms of the timeline between those, that wasn't a direct transition. I'd actually released a couple of other games in that time period. So Metamorphoses, which was a sort of puzzle game that was in some ways similar to Savoir-Faire, and I'd actually forgotten about this until just now, but also a more conversational game called Pytho's Mask. I had been doing a sort of range of different projects, but they were more in the character and multiple ending and, to the extent that there was kind of a new school definition, they were kind of more in that space. Both Galatea and Savoir-Faire actually had their origins in the same sort of larger background project, which is for some years I was working on a game where you could basically do all the things that are difficult to do in interactive fiction. So there were ropes, there were breakable objects, there were things you could set on fire. You could set something on fire and it would burn because it was made of the right material. And then you could use a camera to take a photograph of the thing that was burning and have a photograph that showed that it was burning. And then you could take that photograph and show it to a character that cared about the object you were burning and they would get upset. So there was like all of these ramified systems, each of which individually would be a mess to build, but I was trying to plug them all together. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that project did not get finished and was not launched before I had gotten thoroughly sick of the entire idea it was grounded on. But one of the consequences of working on that project was that I made a bunch of small sort of prototype rooms where I could just test specific systems from it. Galatea actually came from the prototype that I had built to test out the conversation system I was working on. And Savoir-Faire grew out of the prototype for working on materials characteristics, so size, shape, what material is this made of, and so on. And so I really was kind of digging into the potential puzzles that arose out of that, and then gradually realized, oh, this is kind of interesting in itself, and that wound up being its own game.
So you started with the game's mechanics and worked from there. Mm-hmm. Then how did you get to 18th century France as a setting?
I think I always felt that this was a fantasy game. It always felt like the core mechanic felt like magic rather than feeling like technology. But I didn't want to go the direction that a lot of people go. If you're sort of like reaching for a fantasy setting, it's very common, and like certainly was very common then, to reach for a sort of generic medieval knights and wizards kind of scenario. And I really didn't want to do that. I wanted something that had a little bit more flavor and specificity to it. And I had grown up reading a lot of in retrospect, fairly cheesy sort of swashbucklers and romance thrillers of a kind that were like set in the Regency or a little bit earlier. So a lot of Georgette Heyer, a lot of Raphael Sabatini, like these things where the hero was a sort of swashbuckler who would fence with people rather than something else. And so that's really where Pierre comes from. And I imported a lot of the tropes and the assumptions of that setting pretty directly without nearly as much consideration as I would probably, like if I were doing something like that now, I would think about it very differently. But it was a really kind of naive, unconsidered adoption of that setting. I think the other thing that was probably an influence on that was that at the time I was also playing a lot of Seventh Sea, which is a tabletop role-playing game. There are different source books for the different countries that you come from in Seventh Sea. Basically, it is a sort of swashbuckling era 17th, 18th century kind of universe. And the different countries have different magic and cultures associated with them. And if you are from the Italy equivalent, which is called Vodacce in that system, then you could only use its magical powers if you were of a certain aristocratic background, if you were a female character. I'd been playing that setting, and it kind of both bothered me and resonated with me that that would be the case. So then a lot of the sort of background of savoir-faire of, oh, the nobility have a lock on this type of magic, then felt like, okay, well, if that happened, then, that sort of started to trigger a bunch of alternate history and alternate religion and philosophy. Like, if that were how the world worked, then what explanations would people give for that? What implications would that have for how people are conducting diplomacy and things like that? So a lot of the backstory of savoir-faire came out of thinking about those things. And it's never really quite spelled out in the feelies for savoir-faire. It's kind of hinted at. But I was thinking this is the lead up to this universe's equivalent to the French Revolution, right? Like, this is like, people are not cool with this. And so that was kind of underlying the idea as well.
When we started playing, we discussed a little bit about what we thought that savoir-faire meant, and we didn't have a good take on it. When you Google it, it seems like to be a social term perhaps for connected with social grace. And when you Google it further, it seems to be connected with cooking prowess. So what do you, and both things seem to work. So what did you want to convey?
I should admit that I am not like a super awesome speaker of French myself, but my understanding of the term, and certainly the way I was understanding it when I used it, was it's about knowing what to do. And that can apply in lots of different situations, but it's basically kind of a competence that has to do with having wide experience. And sometimes that might play out in a social setting. Like if you have a lot of savoir-faire, then in different social contexts, you know how to behave yourself appropriately. And it felt like a term that, like, first of all, it was kind of creating a setting reference from the outset. And like, if people see something with a French title, they're going to have a different set of expectations about what this is, and they're going to be sort of tipped off a little bit about the flavor of the game. But it also felt like it kind of captured, Pierre comes back home having just spent all of this time in Paris, where we're supposed to understand he's very socially fluent and so on. And then on his return, he's got to solve all of these other problems, which are also dependent on his familiarity with all of these magical techniques. So it wasn't particularly cooking related as such, but it was more the worldliness of the hero as an aspirational target, and that incorporating both social context and magical usage. Now, lots of people find the hero really off-putting, and in retrospect, I understand why. But like where I was coming from at the time, that was what I was thinking of.
I see. We actually quite liked him.
Oh, I'm good. I'm glad.
But that setting, so 18th century France, that's not a historical time period that many people are intimately and immediately familiar with. So I'd like to quote a short excerpt of your own game to you, because there's a pianoforte in the game. And if
yes,
Pierre,
okay,
you know where this is going? If Pierre plays it, or Pierre can play it, and we can type play jazz, and then the game says, quote, "Perhaps you have not quite recognized the era in which this game is set. While historical errors no doubt abound, in parentheses, research being of course inappropriate to a game of this school, such a blatant defiance of period can only break the fourth wall into teeny tiny bits," end quote. And I think First of all, this is a wonderful example of your style of writing in this game, Emily, because it's slightly tongue-in-cheek. It's kind of ironic, since in giving that response, you yourself are breaking the fourth wall into teeny tiny bits. But it also struck us as a little bit coquettish, because I don't believe for a second that no research went into the setting. Or did it?
I mean, certainly much less than would have been wise. So there were a few things that I checked out, but I think, the use of instruments in itself was probably not ideally handled. This is one of the things that's a little bit difficult to reconstruct from here. I think most of the things that might read as researched in the game are things that I just ambiently knew. And that especially includes, like, the Feelies make a lot of mention of Greek and Roman ideas about the Lavori and stuff like that. Like, I was in a PhD program in classics at the time. Like, that wasn't something I needed to go look into. I was just riffing on stuff I was doing in class. And similarly, I looked up specific dates for certain things. And in fact, the andouillettes are something that I heard of online on doing research for what is an appropriate type of sausage or something like that. But it's certainly less research than I would do now. My beta testers caught a number of things where, for instance, there was a color in the wine cellar doors. Initially, there was a reference to cyan doors. And of course, cyan was not a dye that existed at that time. And I think magenta also possibly I was using it. Like, those were both off period.
Both.
So.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, speaking of the wine cellar, there's one example. There's a description which Gunnar and I enjoyed tremendously. The game describes that if the Count wanted to let a guest know that they had outstayed their welcome, he would ask the steward to open one of the Spanish red wines.
Yes,
and we found
I remember this one.
We found it such a wonderful bit of description. And we wondered, is that period accurate, or is that something that you made up?
In retrospect, it feels to me like some bit of snobbery about wine that I had probably picked up from something. I definitely did not go back and do research and like read letters of the time and discover that people were doing this, right? Like, it's definitely not that. It might well be that I had read some novel set in the period where something similar happens, or that I had heard somebody being snarky about Spanish reds or something, and it just felt like a funny thing that would be evocative about who this character was. So, I mean, that's the level at which a lot of those things were constructed.
But you would not go as far to say that this is an educational tool if people wanted to know more about the period, right? Fair enough.
Please do not construct your understanding of 18th century France from this game.
Fair enough. Okay, of course, we would like to talk to you about the design of the game, but let's make a brief detour into technology. Which engine did you actually use to write Savoir-Faire?
Yeah, so this is Inform 6. Inform is the text adventure development system created, as I mentioned, by the person to whom I am now married, but that was not not something I knew at the time.
That would be Graham Nelson.
That would be Graham Nelson. So he built Inform during the 90s initially as a way of letting people create text adventures and compile them to the same system that Infocom had used. So basically, if you write a game file in Inform and compile and export it, you would get a Z5 or Z8 file, which were game files for the Z machine, and the virtual machine that could run them already existed because of Infocom on a lot of different systems. So the advantage of that was, as a creator, if you built something with that system, it was then immediately portable to many other possible play platforms, and you didn't have to do extra work around transferability. And that was really one of the standard modes in which games were being written for the interactive fiction community in the late 90s and early 2000s. That system has subsequently evolved and changed, and we have built a second version of it. So the version that I was using at the times, which was Inform 6, was kind of C-like language in which, if you look at it, it looks like code. You spend a lot of time defining objects with different properties and a little bit of time writing functions and that sort of thing. But it looks like programming. It feels like programming. Subsequently, Graham and I and various other contributors worked on Inform 7, in which you're specifying world state in natural language sentences. So it is a very different experience. It's a different tool. It still compiles to formats that are transferable, although not the Z machine. That's kind of a long story. I mean, you can compile to the Z machine, sort of. It's not ideal. Games for the Z machine tend to not have enough space for what people are trying to do in modern projects. That gets into kind of a side that's probably too much for this particular context to get into. But in terms of why I was using it, it was really, there were sort of two choices that were seriously used. There were a few other systems available, but most games at the time that I was getting involved were in Inform or TADS. And I had really been drawn to a lot of the Inform games in specific. I really liked Curses, which was the game that Graham first wrote in Inform and basically created Inform in order to build Curses. So a lot of things about Inform reflect that project. And I really loved his designer's manual for it because he had created a guide that was both a here is how to code your project guide. So lots of just, if you need to implement a light source, here is how you do it kind of stuff, but also a lot of advice about game design and about successful puzzle construction. And it was very literately written. It was just a beautiful piece of work. And honestly, sort of reading it, I was like, this is my kind of person. Like, it's very, which sounds creepy, except it turned out to be totally true as it happens. But the ability to move back and forth between the more STEM style technical considerations and then what you might call more literary considerations. He talks a bit about the way that prose needs to function in a text adventure game, just a whole bunch of really interesting takes. So I had been drawn towards Inform rather than TADS for a cluster of reasons, but that was what I was using for Galatea, for Metamorphoses, for basically this entire period. I was writing everything in Inform 6.
Did the technology give you any challenges aside from obvious ones like space or something, or did you have to limit yourself in the creative vision? Did the technology form the game?
I mean, I did not experience it that way, right? Like when I was working on this project, I wasn't thinking, oh, I wish I had some other tool that would make this way easier and more awesome. Partly that may have been lack of experience with other tools because, as I have gotten to know more things, I find it easier to get frustrated with a particular tool because I can think of other tools I've used that do that particular thing better. At the time, this was really the only coding system that I had used this heavily or this seriously. And so what it did was just, that was what it did. I did find a lot of challenges around constructing some of the elements of the game, but I don't honestly think that any alternative text adventure system that was available then would have really addressed what was difficult. So for instance, there were a lot of things where it was challenging to get linkages to work properly, like linking two mirrors to each other, for instance, where you link the mirrors and then you can look in one mirror and see what's on the other side of the other mirror. Light can be cast through mirrors. There were a lot of things happening there that are violations of the basic model in the system of how light works and how visibility works and what the player is allowed to refer to and that sort of thing. So I had to do a lot to overcome those things. I think in Inform 7, it would be a bit easier because we put more hooks into those pieces of the engine, partly as a result of having had this experience, right? So that's kind of a backward-looking way to say that the tool constrained me. I also kind of voluntarily opted into another constraint, which is I mentioned that Inform could produce a Z5 file or a Z8 file. A Z8 file was larger, roomier, accommodated more content. Z5 file was the last size of file that Infocom ever built for. And so when I released the initial edition of Savoir-Faire, and after I did a bunch of bug fixing, I couldn't maintain this. But initially I was like, I am releasing this thing as a Z5. Like, I am determined that it is going to be a thing that plausibly, in that sense, could have been an Infocom game. And this, again, it was just a piece of further... There was no technical reason why I needed to do that. It was just a challenge to myself. And that also meant that I needed to do a bunch of things to manage the size of the game, like a lot of the objects in different rooms that are just scenery objects, so things that you can't pick up and move around or really link to anything, a lot of those objects are actually behind the scenes represented by one single object that hops from room to room and gives different descriptions and responds to different words in different locations, just as a way to cut down the number of objects that were in the game, because that was one of the big impacts on memory size. So there's a lot of silly optimization like that.
Would you describe that as hacks that you implemented?
Yeah, probably. I mean, they were reasonably common, well-known hacks at the time. But yeah, I mean, it was like, yes, I suppose so.
Okay, well then let's move on to the game's design. I hear from authors who are writing novels that there are essentially two core approaches to writing. A, to have the plot planned out and the characters and the world defined in advance, and then basically follow the red thread and flesh everything out. And B, just set out from a starting point and then making stuff up as you go.
Yeah.
Would you say that you fit in either of these camps? In particular for how you approach savoir-faire?
For Savoir-Faire, I was definitely in the outliner camp. The core design of it was not pantsed at all. So I tend to build a puzzle graph for any complex puzzle game that I'm working on. And that was a technique that I had learned from the IF community. I think it was especially essential in a game with as many different possible puzzle solutions and so on as this one had. Basically, I sat down and I made a list of all the kinds of puzzles I wanted to include and thought of ways of doing that I felt were interesting with the linking mechanic. I probably slightly cheated with the dancers and the letter. I wanted a decryption puzzle. Various people have complained that that puzzle is not fair and does not correspond to the rest of the system very well, which is probably a fair critique. That's a case where I let one design aspiration override another in a way that was probably not well judged in retrospect. But for the most part, it was like, I really want this to be something where the system of links is being consistently applied. The player often is looking at a situation and thinking, oh, I need an object like this, but I don't have one. So how would I wind up with an object that has those attributes? Or maybe I'm looking at an object, I need it to be different. Like I need it to not be fragile, or I need it to be able to float. That gave me an abstract template for the form that puzzles could have in order to be satisfying with the system. And then I built this big chart on a piece of butcher paper and I implemented the chart. And no other game that I've worked on have I adhered to the chart quite that much from start to finish. But actually, the implementation of Savoir-Faire was not all that long, despite how much of I was talking about the light and mirror puzzle stuff. But I think I released it at the beginning of April. I was looking this up and I spent a couple of months on it, I think. But I think it wasn't a lot longer than that, especially in terms of like major implementation time. In contrast with Counterfeit Monkey, which is another puzzle game I did much later, where like 4 years from start to finish. So the fact that that puzzle chart evolved so little on Savoir-Faire is partly also a reflection of just, it was a very short time period of creation as well.
You mentioned Counterfeit Monkey, which is, even if we only know Savoir-Faire and Galatea and Counterfeit Monkey, these are totally different games, even if they have some things in common, but it's always a very strong concept where you start into it and a strong setting. So how would you describe your creative process with that? How do you go about? Is it experimentational, or how do you write?
Yeah, weirdly, like, I can understand why those three seem very different. They're actually more alike than some of the other things that I've worked on, in the sense that Counterfeit Monkey, again, I wasn't experimenting with something towards that project that I spoke about at the beginning. Like, that had long since died the death, but it did arise from, I was writing a piece of example code for Inform 7 about how you can use regular expressions in the code. And so it was just kind of a toy one-room thing growing out of that. As you play with the mechanic, you realize this is sufficiently fun and it's offering sufficiently many variants that I can expand this out, right? And usually what happens at that point is I have a slight manic phase where I get very excited about the potential of that mechanic and I come up with a bunch of different ideas of what could we do with this. And I think both Savoir-Faire and Counterfeit Monkey are making use of that idea of the player is going to see a requirement that they have in the world, and then they're going to have a system that they can use to convert, like craft some bit of inventory that they have into what they need. And I really like that as a way of guaranteeing multiple solutions, encouraging the player to think in a kind of systematic way. I think Counterfeit Monkey, I finished that game 11, 12 years later than Savoir-Faire. So, it's a much more mature piece of work in that sense. But some of those core ideas and the ability to start with, I've identified something that I think is a fun mechanic, and then everything comes from that persists across all of those. There are some other things that I've written that were much more story first, where it was, I want to explore this particular personality or character or situation, but it just happens that those three aren't it. But with Counterfeit Monkey, even more than Savoir-Faire, Savoir-Faire, I did a bit of let me build out the world in response to what I know about the mechanic. So linking means nobility is pressuring each other by holding each other hostage through links and so on. That all came from the mechanic. Counterfeit Monkey, there was way more that I did that was just extrapolating the mechanic to what would this mean for the world. And that's going to drive everything about what the setting is, what the politics are, just everything.
So if you're coming from the puzzle side and the mechanical side so strongly, in particular in the case of Savoir-Faire, then at which point did you plan out the spatial design of the game world, the map of the house?
Yeah, that was at the beginning too. It was really connected with the puzzle graph, because those two things, like the spatial layout and the order in which puzzles can be solved, obviously are conceptually very interdependent. So, you've got to figure out, okay, which doors are locked by what, where are the things that you need to get past this door located. I really wanted to do something where I was playing with really standard light source and locked door puzzles because of the kind of old school vibe. I wanted to avoid what I dislike about lock and key puzzles in general in adventure games, which is that it's not an interesting puzzle. The baseline lock and key puzzle is I see this locked door, and then whether I have a key or not just depends on whether I happen to have gone to the right other place first. And so it is a gating mechanism in the sense of forcing a linear path through a nonlinear space, which is sometimes useful to do, but it's not actually inviting the player to do anything particularly interesting. Now, of course, like people can do all sorts of fun stuff with how do you get the key in the first place, like maybe accessing the key is the hard part and so on, and then you get to an interesting puzzle again. But I really wanted to take those things and not just have them be arbitrary bottlenecks. I wanted them to be, you need to have demonstrated your understanding of the linking system in a particular way. So there's, in terms of laying out where the puzzles happen on the map, a lot of that is around tutorialization of the system and making sure that the player understand links. Does the player understand unlinking things? Does the player understand reverse links? And staging those to make sure that you've got that. And then also putting bits of backstory in places that are going to provide a bit more context around each of the things that you're learning as you go there.
So the puzzles that you have in the game and the linking mechanic, all of that is means to an end. Mm-hmm. And the end, or let's say the premise of the game initially is that of a treasure hunt. We're going to the mansion to find treasure. Is that also a nod to the classic adventure games, to the Zorks out there, which were treasure hunts?
It's partly that. It's probably also, so partly, yes, just the thing of we're going around and finding expensive stuff and our score goes up every time we find an expensive thing. Like that is a very standard old school thing to do. I think the degree to which that's a misdirection and like this is actually a game about something else, I probably was partly influenced by Curses there as well. So Curses is a very large game in which you start off looking for a map of Paris, but the game overall is not about finding a map of Paris. So I think there was also a little bit of that, okay, I need to tip the hat to the old style of thing, and I also need to give the player a really comprehensible starting point hook, but then what grows out of that is going to come over time.
Given that we have established that Savoir-Faire is really about that linking mechanic, that's the point of origin. Without that, we probably wouldn't have the game. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm very curious, Emily, in hindsight, how do you feel about this mechanic? Did it accomplish what you had in mind?
Yeah, if I hadn't thought the mechanic was fun, I wouldn't have built the game. So in that sense, in a sort of very basic way, I did also write a couple of other games that are set in the same universe later after Savoir-Faire. One of them is a really short puzzle game called Damnatio Memoriae, which is set in that Roman period of link usage and explores some of the more weird and esoteric things that are mentioned in the Savoir-Faire feelies. The feelies suggest like, oh, people did all this other stuff that's not even in the game. And so then I thought, well, what if I made a little game that actually explored some of those things as well? And then I also wrote a game, sort of interactive story piece. It's not a puzzle game at all, called First Draft of the Revolution, which is very different. It's not an inform, it's a custom hypertext game, but it's about somebody who is married into one of these noble families but does not have the powers herself. And it's fleshing out a little bit more of the lead up to that universe's French Revolution. I guess basically it was sort of a thing where I made the mechanic, I enjoyed the mechanic. The mechanic led to fleshing out the setting a little bit more. The more time I spent thinking about the setting, the more I got interested in the social implications of something like that existing. But then making a game about the social implications is a very different kind of game, because that's not really a game about whether corks float. It's a game about like how people feel about each other. And so that needed to be very differently built out. I'm not sure. I feel like I wound up someplace completely different from where the question was originally pointing. But
we'll do it the other way around. I'm going to share with you our impression and our assessment of the system. And I'm curious about your opinion on that, because there's a lot of wonderful things about Savoir-Faire. And as I mentioned, we enjoyed it tremendously. But I think Gunnar and I have our reservations about the efficacy of the linking system. And that is primarily because ultimately it was surprisingly opaque in terms of its rules on two levels, because first of all, you have to understand whether objects can be linked or not. And that depends on their properties and similarities. And we couldn't really wrap our heads around when two objects would be similar enough to link. And we found it somewhat inconsistent. Whether that's correct or not, I don't know. But our impression was sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and we don't really get why. That's the first level of where it's slightly opaque. And the second is, once you have the objects linked, what does that actually mean? In which way do they interact? Given that there's also two different ways to link them with the normal and the reverse link, and they do different things. For instance, when we first experimented with linking, there's this one puzzle where you have to remove a brick from a fireplace. And we tried linking that to a stone, which worked, similar size, similar properties. And then we simply tried moving that stone, throwing it around, dropping it, because we thought movement would be transferred in some way. But apparently that's not how linking works, right? So that is, at least in this case, in terms of hinged objects which can be open, then it is movement that is transferred. So again, there's a level of understanding which is quite elusive. And in the end, after playing the game for 5 weeks, if you had asked us to write down a definitive rule set of how linking works, I think we couldn't.
Interesting, yeah.
It has not become entirely clear. And so we felt that the system, which sounded pretty cool, and to be honest, it made us think about objects in a different way. It was fun to experiment, but it's not intuitive, I would say.
That's really interesting. So I got a little bit of that kind of feedback at the time of release, but not all that much. And I'm wondering, as you're describing that, under the hood, with the exception of the dancers and the letter, most of the behavior of the system is not especially special cased. It's very systematic. And people who played it at the time, like it was recognized to be a hard game, and I got various feedback about that. But I felt like people did tend to understand the kinds of things that you're talking about. And I think possibly the context that they had that you didn't necessarily have is understanding what things are typically properties of objects in these kinds of games. So meaning like being open or being closed is something that is natively implemented in the system. And one of the things about the hobbyist community that I was part of at the time, and that was really the only community I envisaged ever playing this game, was most of the people who were playing these games were also writing them. There were relatively few people who were just players and never wrote any. So it was very common for people to have a pretty solid understanding of like, how are these things typically implemented? And so a lot of when things are linked, you can change whether it's giving light, you can change whether it's open or closed. If you looked at informed source code, it would be really obvious why these things, not other things, right? I mean, it's interesting that you say that, because I haven't thought about what that experience would be like coming from somebody who doesn't know. I mean, obviously you've played a bunch of these retro games, but I feel like it's...
We are old school text adventure gamers, so I get what you mean. Understanding properties is probably not the problem. For me, it comes down to if authors create systems of magic. It's the same in novels, in fantasy novels, for instance, or in role-playing games or something like that. Typically, it's not necessary to understand the rules behind the magic system. Okay, there are fireballs. Now you can levitate. It's magic, right?
Yeah.
Because typically, there is no necessity to inspect the rules of that system. It's about the results. But your entire game is about understanding the rules of magic.
No, indeed.
And of course, we're scrutinizing these rules then because our progress hinges on understanding them. And then it becomes very readily apparent when there are supposed inconsistencies, whether they exist on the code level or not. But that's the experience that we had.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fair critique. And I'm sure there's more that I could have done to communicate some of those things more explicitly. Or I think there are definitely times where particular puzzles are just, as I say, not quite being fair by the rules. So like the dancer puzzle being the main example of that. I think the question around open or closed versus physical translation in space, the way that I understood that, which is probably not communicated to the player, and this also applies to turning the key in the lock, is if we're imagining these items as part of a system, the lid of a box is part of the box, right? Or the sword in the sword cane, it's kind of conceptually one object. And so the relative configuration of those objects, or the cork being in the bottle or not in the bottle, which you also can solve in a similar way if you don't have the corkscrew, like all of those things I saw as what is the disposition of the parts of this object relative to one another, rather than what is the location of this object in space. And so on that basis, I was thinking of this object has a particular status rather than this object is in a particular place in space. And I think that was when I was working out what those rules were. That was kind of how I was thinking about it. Whether I did enough to make that clear to the player. I mean, so ways that I could have improved on that, probably, aside from a little bit more design discipline about constructing the puzzles in the first place. I also think the loaf of bread, it's not obvious enough that it's similar to the brick, and the stone is a bit of a red herring. So, like, I get all of that. So a little bit more puzzle discipline in the design. And that, again, is a thing where I think Counterfeit Monkey dealt with that much better. I can come back to why I think it did. But also maybe a little bit more clarity in failure feedback. The system does do a little bit in terms of looking at, okay, you try to link these two things. Under the hood, it's giving you a score for how much similarity there is in particular regards. But it maybe could have been a little bit more transparent about this match, this did not match. And there again, Counterfeit Monkey, if you try to change the composition of an object, it will explicitly tell you, this is the thing that was spelled by what you were trying to do, so that's wrong. And it, I think, gives players a lot more clarity about what failed.
What I understand now is how you were thinking much more systematically, or in terms of systems.
Yeah.
And we were thinking more like identifiers. Is it the color? Sometimes. Is it the form? Sometimes. Is it the composition of materials? Sometimes. Is it any two of those? Sometimes it's just one. Sometimes it must be two. When you open the door, it has to have a hinge and the crest.
Yeah.
And that was what kind of confused us. So how is this similar enough? And how is it allowed that I cannot move the brick by moving the stone, but I can move the water out of the well? That took us hours. Let's just say the whole well puzzle was tough.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's not one that I had envisioned being especially difficult at that point in the game. So, yeah, sorry about that. I mean, so again, the distinction there is going to be movement of an object versus this is empty or full. And I completely get why that's confusing. But yeah, I mean, I think what I would have needed to do to address the thing that you're talking about is like really make the under the hood scoring system much more explicit. So it's doing things like if you want to link things to make each other open or close, it needs to be something that conceptually could be open or closable. In fact, I'm just going to really quickly see whether I may not be able to locate this in the source, but
now we're into a deep dive.
Well, I mean, I'm curious now.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, okay. So there were a handful of things, it looks like, that had constrained this must be able to link to that. And I think that's an implementation to support the dancers, which should have been a tip off to me that I needed to do that. That was probably not fair.
Funny enough, we had absolutely no issue with the dances in our playthrough. That was straightforward. There's dancers on the paper.
Yeah.
There's this model of dancers. Okay, they should connect, and they did.
But I spent 2 hours brute forcing the riddle before that was a mistake.
Yeah. Well, it was intentionally a difficult transposition cipher rather than a standard substitution cipher, because if it had been an easy substitution cipher, people would have just solved that directly. So, okay, so you can't link things to themselves. You can't link liquids to other liquids. You can't link things that are not of the linkable class, which is basically a way of dealing with, you're talking about a window or building or something. And that's one where it probably, like, the feedback that it gives for that is probably unhelpful, because it just says you valiantly try to link the two objects, but they seem as though they'll never go together. That's a case where probably I could have given a better explanation of, like, no, you are trying to interact with something that is just not supported. And a lot of those things are scenery objects in a space or something like that. You can't link something if the link already exists to that same thing. So basically, like, remaking the same link. It will automatically unlink things if you've already linked them to something else and you're trying to make a new link. Yeah, so at that point, after it's gotten through all of that, then it starts doing checks of if they both have a shape and the shape matches, that increases their score. If they both have a shape and a size and their size matches, that increases the score. If they both have a material, so like stone or glass or whatever, and the material matches, that increases the score. If they're both openable, that increases the score. If they're containers, that increases the score. So basically, it's working through a whole bunch of things that are basically properties in inform, right? Like, do these things match? Are these things connected? I mean, material and shape are not standard inform properties. Those are things that I had put in, but are both things legible? That increases the score. So it's going down and doing all of these things. But I suspect the problem from a player perspective is that all of the feedback that you're getting from all of that consideration is either like, if the score is close to working, but it's just not quite enough, it'll say they're just a little too different. And then if they're really just, you're not even coming close, they'll just say just too dissimilar. But that is not probably enough information to support understanding quickly enough. I didn't read the whole score list off either. There's like, is it a door? Is it a light giver? Is it a mirror? Does it have an edge? So apparently linking bladed objects works well. And the other really interesting, interesting, probably very boring fact, but a thing that I noticed looking at this code is like it contains a ton of debugging print stuff so that past me could get an explicit readout of why things were linking and not linking. So clearly I needed that when I was building the game. I just did not feel that the player did, which may well have been a mistake. Maybe it would have been much easier if that were more explicit.
Well, thank you for the look under the hood. I think ultimately you were building a system that had never been built before. And that comes with new gameplay challenges, of course. And I think that makes Savoir-Faire not just an entertaining game, it's also an interesting educational piece in terms of game design, because you can look at that system, look at your implementation, and then discuss, okay, which things worked, which maybe didn't work that well. And that's something that Gunnar and I quite enjoyed, wrapping our head around the system, speculating, how does it actually work? What happens under the hood? Now we know. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Happy to. Sorry to make you wait a minute to pull that up.
No, that's fine. I think we should move to the story part, because that's also something that we wanted to talk to you about. Just one more thing in terms of gameplay, because that's something that, that's pretty noticeable during the game, is that Pierre gets hungry at a certain point. And one of the main quests, so to speak, is create something to eat. Why did you implement that hunger mechanic?
Why did I torture the player in this fashion? I mean, this was partly, it was a bit of old school riffing, partly, but intentionally a much gentler one than, there are a lot of old school games where if you do not eat something in a certain amount of time, you will just die, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. And it tends to be very annoying. So I wanted to nod to the existence of that mechanic, but not actually make it kill you. A number of the people who've said that they don't like Pierre on a personal level have said they don't like him specifically because he is so obsessed with food.
And obnoxious about it.
It may be relevant that during the time period that I was building all of this, I was a graduate student on a graduate student stipend, and there were times when I could not afford quite enough food. I mean, I don't want to like over egg this situation. I was not like living in poverty in general, but it was just like I had actual experiences of what I guess we would now call food insecurity. And so I knew what it was like to be hungry enough that it was distracting and making it genuinely difficult to get anything done without it being in any sense like a threat. Like I wasn't going to starve to death. I just felt a bit faint and couldn't focus. And so probably a certain amount of that was coming into this, but I didn't, it's not a game about my life problems. So I didn't want to lean into the realism of that. So instead it's infracted through Pierre's personality and the fact that he's used to eating super fancy things. And so it makes a joke out of that. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of where that's coming from, I think, is the idea of morphing that trope a little bit. And then once you do finally solve that puzzle, that's a trigger for some end game information, as you will have seen.
Okay, then let's talk a bit about the storytelling, about the narration. So if on a mechanical level, you set out to create an old school game experience, did this also extend to your approach to the text, to the storytelling?
In some respects, I mean, it's a game in which almost everything happens off stage, right? Like you don't have any direct interaction with another character until the very end. And even there, it's obviously like highly mediated how that happens. So old school games, but I would say even more kind of the games that were post-Infocom, like the sort of 90s games, I guess is what I mean by this, that there would be more story than you got in a typical Infocom game, especially something like Enchanter. Like some of the mysteries have more story, but it was common in the 90s period for there to be more story than that, but for it to be predominantly presented as backstory that you were uncovering pieces of as you played what was still a very isolated adventure game. And I was really trying to not tackle NPC interaction problems in this game because the whole place that it was coming from is having a spot to focus on some different kinds of things.
So one thing where we felt while playing the game that it feels kind of old school is that Savoir-Faire is quite economical with its text. In the descriptions of the rooms, in the scenes which are actually played out. So there's not that much text in the game. There's not a lot of exposition that we're getting. Probably a deliberate choice.
Yeah.
But in terms of the economy, I wonder whether that's with something that you mentioned earlier, that you were deliberately trying to keep this lean.
Yeah. So two things there. I mean, it was partly that space counted, and so I was being cautious about that. It was partly a stylistic thing. As you say, like a lot of the games that I was drawing on are not verbose, like I'm going to get paragraphs in response to an action kind of thing. So, and the tempo of text really matters a lot to the feel of interactive fiction. So if you're playing something where you can take lots of actions and you only are getting relatively condensed responses to each one, that tends to feel very different and very much more like things are in the player's lap. And the more you get into a space where you take one action and then there's a lot of response to that action, that can feel like the system is dominating more. So anyway, I mean, so there's aesthetic considerations around that. There was also a little bit around, I want to try and avoid generating too many red herrings. I definitely noticed looking through transcripts of people playing that they certainly ran into things where input nouns should have been recognized but weren't. So that's a little bit of a flaw in the implementation of it. But I think I was also consciously trying to avoid having rooms that were described as having lots of scenery objects in them, which then not only would I have to implement them, and that would be a problem for space, but it would also mean that the player would then think those objects also might come into play in some way, which I didn't want to support. So it was partly about creating that focus as well.
We quite liked that you didn't give that much text and exposition during gameplay, but you had this command remember where you snuck in a little bit of more text, which we found quite nice. A very good way of handling that, giving sense to objects that are otherwise not usable. And also, we wanted to say that the vignettes you wrote for this remember command are utterly delightful. We so much like them. Brilliantly written, not overlong, conveying a feeling, a setting, a personality trait of somebody you're describing. Those are great. So we like that very much.
Oh, thank you.
I would also like to add that I think Savoir-Faire is a wonderful example of fragmented storytelling because we're piecing together, well, essentially we as players are piecing two layers of mystery at the same time because we do not get much exposition about Pierre, our protagonist, and about the past, the relation to Marie and the Count, and that's something that we're finding out. And then there's, of course, the mystery about what happened to Marie, and that's the second level that we're finding out. And our understanding of that depends on which fragments we're finding and how we're interpreting them. And we found that truly enjoyable.
Oh, good. Yeah.
I'd like to give you an example because there was this point towards the end of the game when we finally managed to unlock the Count's study and enter it. And then we found that the study was in shambles, the furniture thrown about and the desk had been hacked to pieces. And this sparked quite a discussion between Gunnar and me about what had happened here. Who ransacked that place? Why this room and not any of the other ones? How did they get in since the door was locked? And we debated, were these the Baron Danvers men or was it Marie who did that? And we ultimately concluded that it must have been the Count himself who wrecked his own study. Maybe due to a mix of grief and rage about his wife's death. But this is pure conjecture. This is never resolved within the game itself. And we thought it was great that the game allowed for this level of speculation. But in this case, we would love to have some closure. Emily, so was it the Count who wrecked his own study or was it someone else?
I mean, this puts me in a spot because I don't now remember why that beat is there. I think the implication... Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know. I would love to be able to give you that closure, but I don't remember that now, why I decided to do that.
No, that's fine. Then we have to live with the uncertainty, but that's okay.
You mentioned the feelies, so you must have seen those as well. So those provide a little bit more framework, but not, I think, an answer to that question.
No, we noticed.
Sorry.
While we're already at that point, let me pick your brain on another mystery.
Sure.
And I'm not sure whether you can answer that, but I'm going to try anyway, because there's a thing with regards to the story which remains unclear to me. An important source of information for us to understand the plot are letters. And there are two letters that the Count has written to Marie. There's the old letter, which we find in Marie's desk. And that contains information that Marie and Pierre have been linked in the past.
Yeah.
So they're linked together. And then there's the letter in the feelies, which is also a letter from the Count to Marie. That helps us understand why the Countess was killed. But in both cases, these letters are still sealed, both in the game and in the feelies. And the question is, why does Marie not open her father's letters? Can you help us understand that?
I mean, so the feelies one is set temporally after everything has happened. This I can relatively easily answer, I think. So the feelies one is basically an epilogue.
Yeah.
And I think it actually says at the end, I'm on my way, I may get there before this letter even does. And I think what I was imagining is like the Count sends this letter, but he also hurries back to see them get married or whatever, and they're busy and they do all of that and they don't really worry about, the letter eventually arrives, but all the news has come and it's tossed aside. And like, that's probably, if I were Marie, I would have opened it anyway, but nonetheless, like that I feel, and that's the in-world explanation. The out-of-world explanation for why I have a sealed envelope there is that I remembered how awesome it was in the Infocom Wishbringer feelies that there was a sealed envelope that explicitly told you not to open until the game told you to open it. I thought it was a wonderful feely experience, and so I wanted to do something similar to that. So that's the out-of-world reason for that one.
An der Stelle eine ganz kurze Unterbrechung, weil ich möchte noch was ergänzen, was uns Emily hinterher nach dem Gespräch dann noch erzählt hat und was mir und ich glaube auch Gunnar nicht klar war, als wir das Spiel gespielt haben. Diese feelies, die kennen wir ja nur als digitale Version, als PDF. So findet man sie zum Beispiel in der Interactive Fiction Database. Und darin ist dieser Brief, von dem Emily gerade gesprochen hat, als offenes, lesbares Dokument dargestellt. Und wir sind davon ausgegangen, das gehört halt einfach von vornherein zu den feelies dazu. Was uns nicht klar war, das waren ursprünglich tatsächliche physikalische Gegenstände. Emily hat nämlich damals in dieser kleinen Interactive Fiction Community, von der sie ja jetzt schon mehrmals gesprochen hat, rumgefragt, ob denn genügend Leute bereit wären, $5 dafür zu zahlen, dass sie tatsächlich Feelies herstellen lässt. Also gedruckt auf Papier. Und da war das Feedback so gut, da kam so viel zusammen, dass sie das dann hat machen lassen. Das heißt, wer damals im Jahr 2002 Savoir-Faire gespielt hat und in dieser Community war, der konnte diese Feelies per Post von Emily bekommen. Und da war dieser Brief dann tatsächlich versiegelt. Und der Gedanke war, so wie das in dem Anschreiben drin steht, dass man den wirklich erst öffnet, wenn man das Spiel durch hat. Das heißt, das hätten wir gar nicht lesen dürfen, bevor wir in das Spiel eigentlich einsteigen. Ich erwähne es aber auch hauptsächlich deswegen nochmal, weil mir das überhaupt nicht bewusst war, dass es zu diesem Spiel eine Sammlerkomponente gibt, weil es offensichtlich einen ganz kleinen Run von physischen Feelies gab, die irgendwo da draußen in der Welt existieren müssen und die heutzutage damit auf jeden Fall Seltenheitswert haben. Aber damit zurück zu Emily.
The in-world, in-game example of an unopened letter. Are you talking about...
The encrypted letter that we've been mentioning before. The dancer
letter. The encrypted letter. So as I understand it, what's happened there is that she doesn't solve the puzzle. Like, she doesn't realize how to access that. And there's some references in the game to her feeling like, not that she's mad at her father, but she's just like, you could have left me a bit more help here. And the thing is, he had left her help. She just hadn't realized that that was how she needed to approach that problem. So Pierre has solved a puzzle that Marie didn't solve. And we can imagine lots of different potential reasons for why that is. I mean, clearly she is very technically adept with the Lavori, so it's not like, oh, she couldn't have figured out at a technical level how to do that. But if we imagine the house is full of a lot of objects, she doesn't necessarily know which one of them she should be paying attention to, and she's under a lot of stress. Like, you can imagine a lot of reasons why it wouldn't necessarily occur to her to try and resolve this letter, which has been around for, I think inside the document, it also kind of implies that he's leaving this well in advance of anything else happening.
Yeah.
And so sort of what I imagined her... Okay, I should honestly say, this is what I think I intended. I only came up with this interpretation on rereading the transcripts 2 days ago. So I can't swear this is what I intended, but I think what I intended, like reconstructing from the content that's there and the way that I used to think about these things, I would guess that this was a thing that had been in the house for a long time. She did not recognize it as potentially a thing that would solve her problem or be a message to her from her father. And she's also grown up in a household where she's used to her father having all of these diplomatic secrets and things that he's working on, right? So she might well think, oh, this is associated with one of his, whatever, deals with somebody, and it's been here for ages. It's clearly not like the thing that I need right now. Whereas Pierre comes in as much of I haven't been here for a long time, everything looks new to me, and work this all out. So anyway, I think that's the understanding of the situation that I have now. But I think that's what I meant, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. Since the game specifically calls it an old letter, It makes sense to assume that it's been lying there for so long that Marie maybe simply forgot about it.
Yeah.
We would like to ask one or two more questions about the game's impact in general. So the game, when it came out in 2002, it was then highly decorated. There was the yearly Sissy Awards back then, and you won 4 of those, including the award for Best Interactive Fiction Game of the Year. What was your reaction to this amount of recognition?
I mean, one is generally pleased by getting community feedback like that. It wasn't the first time I was winning a Zizzy Award. I was happy to get that. It was simultaneously very flattering and cool, and it's something to be happy about. And also, like, in the context of understanding this isn't an Oscar, like, this is a small community, it's a small competition, it's et cetera. So I think I was pleased and happy to be part of the community traditions, and that community meant a lot to me then, as it does in a different way now. But I mean, time passes, things change. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was like a life-changing event or something specifically to get that kind of recognition.
Did you write the game to win this award? So because you were thinking, this conversational game is hard to win a Sissy with that. The jurors are so conservative. Now I'll give them what they can't deny.
Yeah. No, I don't feel like it was. I mean, again, like, it's difficult to reconstruct exactly what I was thinking at the time, but I wasn't trying to do that, I don't think. like I was trying to make it virtuosic in a certain way. So that's why, like the sort of business of gratuitously stuffing it down into a Z5 file. And I think the first release of the game, actually, when you compile it, it says how many bytes of space are remaining. And I think I'd actually sized it perfectly so there were no bytes remaining available. It was like exactly the size of the Z5. And so like there were things like that where it was like I was doing things that were kind of gratuitously difficult. And some of the puzzle implementation was also gratuitously difficult. But it was not so much like, oh, I'm going to show. I mean, these people were my friends, right? Like, it wasn't like I had some sort of massive grudge against them or something. So it wasn't like I was trying to, in a hostile way, prove a point. It was more like, it's just fun to try and do these like stupidly hard things. It's like people posting pictures to social media of really incredibly hard cakes they made. It's just fun to do something really difficult and then share that with people.
Well, as we mentioned, this was the early days of your career and many more games would follow. You would write many more games, also more text adventure games. In light of this portfolio, how do you regard Savoir-Faire? Does it stand out in any way to you? How important was it?
I guess there are a couple of ways of answering that. It's not one of the games that people come back and talk to me now about the most. I was a little bit surprised when you reached out about it. I tend to get the most ongoing contact about Galatea and Counterfeit Monkey, and occasionally stuff about other things, and to a degree B, which is a very different kind of game. So if I had to make a short list of what are the top 3 games that seem to have made a long-term impression on people, probably it would not be one of them. In terms of evolution as a designer, it was part of a continuum. I mean, maybe an important part, but it wasn't even the first time that I was building something around trying to make a sort of systematic mechanic. Metamorphoses was doing something in that zone as well. It just wasn't nearly as large and ambitious with what it was trying to do, and so it didn't test some of the angles of that quite as much. It was an important learning experience, and I certainly have a bunch of memories about writing it and especially about debugging it. But I wouldn't say that it by itself changed everything. The thing about writing it that I actually think back to the most, and this is not something that we've talked about at all in this conversation so far, is one of the things that I had to write for it was a description of what happens when you throw one object at another. Because there's the puzzle where the bauble's on a shelf and you have to get it down and it needs to react a bunch of different ways depending, like, is it hard itself? Have you made it not fragile, or does it break? Does it roll off? If it falls on the floor, does that break? And in order to build that, I made a generalized system that could also handle things like, I threw something at a fragile container, so the thing fell out of the container. So to do that, like, it wasn't enough just to have a big switch statement in code. I really needed to composite the sentences describing what had happened. And that was an exercise in procedurally generating the text to reflect a really complex world state outcome. That was the thing that I had not had to do before that I did in Savoir-Faire, like I think more than almost any of the other stuff. And that was something that I did wind up coming back to a lot in different ways over many years on other projects as my ambitions became more extensive. Not really sure how to phrase that, but like as I built more and more complicated systems that I needed to explain to the player. And arguably one of the things that was, if I had applied that same level of specificity to why linking was failing, maybe that would have made the game much more accessible. I don't know.
I'm glad that you mentioned the bauble on shelf puzzle, because I think that is a wonderful example of why the game's difficulty is deservedly rated cruel. Not because it's difficult to get the bauble off the shelf. That was easy for Gunnar and me, but then we realized, I think hours later, that the object that we threw onto the shelf to get the bauble down is lost to us because we cannot get that down. And of course, we threw something that we needed for another puzzle and only realized it hours later. So that is a dead man walking situation. No, that's fine. And since you mentioned the mechanical level, we then stood under that shelf and threw dozens of objects at it. So our entire inventory.
Yeah.
And in the course of doing that, then if you throw a bottle, for instance, it shatters. Then you have glass on the floor. If there is a liquid in that container, it will spill on the floor. So it was really an interesting exercise. Fruitless, of course, but interesting because of all the things that happen.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so you got to see the breakage experience in detail.
Yeah, indeed. I'm a bit sad to hear that Savoir-Faire is a game that not many people contact you about, because we think it's a wonderful game. So we had a great experience playing it. I mean, it is an old school experience. That means it's supposed to be challenging, and frustrations are baked into that system. They're part of the expectation. So we didn't mind being frustrated once in a while, because that also meant it's more satisfying if you actually work out the solution. And the one thing that really shines, that stands out, is the prose, is your approach to storytelling. Outstanding. We were absolutely delighted, as Gunnar mentioned. And we would recommend the game to anyone.
Oh, great. Well, that's lovely to hear.
Emily, thank you so much for taking the time, for being here and talking to us about Savoir-Faire. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks for asking. It was really interesting to go back through those materials, which I have not looked at for a long time. So, yeah, thank you.
So, hallo, hier ist nochmal Gunnar. Wir sprechen jetzt ein bisschen Deutsch miteinander, ihr und ich. Ich erzähle euch jetzt nämlich auf Deutsch nochmal in einer launigen, schnellen Zusammenfassung, was die Emily uns erzählt hat. Also, zum Einstieg hat Emily uns erzählt, dass sie schon als Kind Textadventures gespielt hat und dann sofort Lust hatte, eigene Spiele zu bauen. Sie hat da Infocom und die Adventures von Scott Adams als Beispiele genannt. Eine Karriere im Gaming hat sie natürlich lange für unrealistisch gehalten. Sie hat dann klassische Philologie studiert und war auch am Ende in der PhD-Phase, bevor sie dann die Interactive Fiction Community entdeckt hat und gesehen hat, dass die da mit Tools solche Adventures bauen. Savoir-Faire, das hat sie nebenher geschrieben, hat sie uns erzählt, heimlich sozusagen, während sie eigentlich dabei war, am PhD zu arbeiten. Ihr Betreuer wusste da gar nichts von. Ihr erstes Spiel, das war Galatea, das basiert auf dem Mythos von Pygmalion und Galatea. Die Spieler sprechen darin mit einer Statue, die lebendig ist. Emily hatte das Ziel, eine Figur zu erschaffen, die Emotionen zeigt, die sich erinnert, die genervt sein kann, die Themen meidet und die auf Gesprächswiederholungen reagiert. Ich meine, hey, das ist im Jahr 2002, ja, lange vor irgendwelchen Gesprächs-KIs. Sie wollte weg von den damals rein funktionalen NPCs der damaligen Interactive Fiction Szene, die halt im Wesentlichen Puzzle-Hinweise gegeben haben und die immer wiederholt haben. Das System, mit dem sie das gebaut hat, Inform, das war eigentlich ja ursprünglich gebaut, um damit Räume und Objekte darzustellen. Und sie hat dieses Objektmodell trickreich für Gesprächsthemen eingesetzt. Große Themen enthalten Unterthemen, Themen werden erst sichtbar, wenn sie genannt werden. Eigentlich sind diese Themen alles Objekte. Dann hat sie viel interne Logik da reinbauen müssen, um Mehrdeutigkeiten aufzulösen. Also das war schon ein großer Schritt. Die Szene der Interactive Fiction Leute, die war sehr klein. Man kannte sich, aber bei der Veröffentlichung von Galatea hat sie sehr viel ausführliche Reviews bekommen, viel Aufmerksamkeit in dieser kleinen Szene. Sie hat dann vor Savoir-Faire noch weitere Spiele gemacht, Metamorphosis und Phythos Mask. Die gehen beide eher schon in die Richtung systemische Mechanik und Charakter. Also nicht nur ein reines Gesprächsmodell wie bei Galatea. Dann haben wir natürlich gefragt, wie Savoir-Faire entstanden ist, und dann hat sie uns erzählt, dass sie schon ganz früh ein unfertiges Megaprojekt hatte. Ein Projekt, in dem sie alle schwierigen Interactive Fiction Systeme gleichzeitig bauen wollte. Sie wollte Seile haben, Feuer, brennende Materialien, Kameras, Fotos, Reaktionen darauf. Und das hat sie dann in so Miniräumen ausprobiert, wie das gehen könnte. Und daraus sind Keimzellen entstanden für andere Spiele, insbesondere für Galatea. Das entsteht dann sozusagen aus der Konversationskeimzelle, und Savoir-Faire, das entsteht aus der Keimzelle für Materialeigenschaften und das magische Linken. Das war auch schon eine frühe Idee. Und dieser Link-Mechanismus, den sie sich ausgedacht hat, der war gar nicht als spezifisch magisch geplant, aber der hat sich halt so magisch angefühlt, und deswegen musste dann Savoir-Faire auf eine Art ein Fantasy-Spiel werden. Aber sie wollte halt bewusst nicht so eine typische Ritter-Zauberer-Welt, sondern hat sich da ein neues Setting gesucht. Beim Setting hatte sie viel Inspiration aus den Romanzen von Georgette Heyer. Die hat Romanzen geschrieben über die Regency-Ära. Das war die Zeit zwischen 1810 und 1820. Ist mehr was für Engländer bedeutsam ist, und die historischen Romane von Raphael Sabatini. Und das Tabletop The Seventh Sea hat sie beeinflusst. Da gibt es nämlich aristokratische Magiesysteme, also Magie, die nur bestimmten Gruppen zugänglich ist. Dann haben wir gefragt, wie sie auf den Titel Savoir-Faire gekommen ist und was das zu bedeuten hat für sie. Und sie meinte, naja, die Bedeutung sei sowas wie Weltwissen, soziale Klugheit, Kompetenz in vielen Situationen. Und sie hat damit 2 Dinge erreichen wollen. Zum ersten einfach ein französisches Flair, damit man schon mit einer Erwartungshaltung in das Spiel reingeht. Aber es sollte auch zu der Person des Pierre passen, der so ein weltgewandter Mann ist, der aus der großen Stadt kommt und jetzt hier auf dem Land dieses Abenteuer erlebt. Wir haben gefragt, wie sie recherchiert hat für das Thema und sie meinte, ach, gar nicht viel, weniger als man vielleicht denken könnte. Sie wusste halt einfach schon relativ viel, weil sie ja ein klassisches Philologiestudium gemacht hat und da sich einfach in bestimmten Themen ganz gut auskannte, auf das sie dann zurückgreifen konnte. Sie hat natürlich trotzdem ein paar historische Fehler gemacht, die dann von Testern und Testerinnen gefunden worden sind. Sie hat zum Beispiel Farbstoffe wie Cyan und Magenta im Spiel gehabt und die gab es damals noch nicht. Das ist übrigens eine Diskrepanz, die ist Christian und mir in der Staffel gar nicht richtig aufgefallen, aber Christian hat ein paar Mal von Magenta gesprochen und bei mir hieß das Russet, dieselbe Farbe. Wir haben uns einmal ein bisschen gewundert, was der andere da erzählt, aber das haben wir nicht thematisiert, aber das war, weil Christian eine frühere Version gespielt hat, das war einer dieser Fehler, den Tester gefunden haben und der dann noch ausgemerzt worden ist. Sie hat das Spiel geschrieben mit Inform 6, weil es damals das verbreitete Tool war. Inform 7 gab es noch nicht und sie hat sich früh in dieses Inform-Ding verliebt, weil es da so ein fantastisches Lehrmaterial dazu gab, das Designers Manual, das hat einer der Designer geschrieben, Graham Nelson, und das hat sie in glühenden Worten beschrieben, das sei lustig und literarisch fast, aber trotzdem total gut erklärt und so. Und sie hat ja den Graham Nelson auch später geheiratet. Also da hat eins zum anderen geführt. Aber damals, als sie das gelesen hat, kannten sie noch nicht persönlich. Das kam erst später. Wir haben gefragt, ob das für sie eine einschränkende Plattform war, ein enges System, mit dem sie Schwierigkeiten hatte. Und sie meinte, nee, fand sie nicht. Sie kannte aber auch einfach nichts anderes. Das war halt damals das Tool. Sie hat dann sogar noch technische Einschränkungen sich selber gesucht zusätzlich. Sie hat die Release-Version als Z5-Datei rausgebracht. Das ist einfach das historische Infocom-Format. Das hätte sie nicht machen müssen. Ja, das war ja Jahre nach Infocom. Das war ein selbsterlegtes Limit, um das Spiel mehr Oldschool zu machen. Da musste sie dann relativ viele Tricks nutzen, um Speicher zu sparen. Zum Beispiel gibt es Objekte, die es in jedem Raum gibt und die dann aber in jedem Raum neu beschrieben werden, damit halt nicht so viele Objekte in dem Spiel vorkommen müssen. Sie hat das Spiel vom Puzzle-Design her geplant, auf großem Papier, so Puzzlegraphen so aufgezeichnet. Es war ihr ganz wichtig, dass dieser Link-Mechanismus überall konsistent funktioniert und sie wollte Rätsel haben, die systematisch sind. Es ging halt immer um Form und Größe, Materialien, offene und geschlossene Dinge, Licht und so weiter. Ihr war schon klar, dass manche Rätsel aus heutiger Sicht unfair sind, zum Beispiel dieser Brief, den man da entschlüsseln muss. Und sie meinte auch, dass das Spiel zu wenig erklärt, warum ein Link nicht funktioniert. Das Spiel antwortet halt dann mit, ja, diese Objekte sind zu verschieden, aber dahinter steht ein ganz elaborates System, das der Ähnlichkeit einen Score gibt. Das kann halt mehr oder weniger verschieden sein, aber das Spiel gibt ja bloß eine Antwort, im Wesentlichen, es geht nicht. Denn dieser Algorithmus, der prüft schon relativ viele Eigenschaften. Sie hat genannt Größe, Form, Material, Container, ob der offen ist oder nicht offen ist, ob es nicht Quelle ist, ob es eine Kante hat und alle möglichen Sachen. Aber davon kriegt der Spieler nicht so viel mit. Das Spiel schreibt das halt intern schon auf und das hätte man dem Spieler zeigen können, dann wäre ein bisschen transparenter gewesen, wie der Link-Mechanismus funktioniert und das hätte vielleicht ein bisschen die Frustration an ein paar Stellen verringert, vielleicht auch sogar für Christian und mich. Wir haben sie gefragt, wie das Spiel Einfluss auf ihr späteres Wirken genommen hat und sie hat uns erzählt, dass viele Ideen und Konzepte in Counterfeit Monkey nochmal auftauchen. Das ist ja ihr bekanntestes Textadventure. Dort ist aber dann die systematische Rückmeldung klarer und die Mechaniken sind deutlich ausgereift als halt ein späteres Spiel. Aber beide Spiele folgen einer Kernidee. Die Spieler craften sich Objekte zurecht, um Anforderungen erfüllen zu können. Wir haben auch ein bisschen über das Leveldesign gesprochen und die Raumstruktur. Sie hat uns erzählt, dass sie natürlich klassische Gating-Mechaniken einsetzt. Also im Spieldesign nennt man so Systeme, wo Wege verschlossen sind am Anfang, damit der Spieler nicht überall hin kann. Das gibt es ja hier auch. Ne? Man kann ja am Anfang noch nicht in das Haupthaus gehen. Und sie meinte aber, dass das so eingesetzt sei, dass es systemisch Sinn ergibt und dass das dann auch einen Tutorial-Effekt haben kann, wie ja die Küche quasi das Tutorial ist für das Haus. Dass man da erstmal sich ein bisschen ausprobieren kann, ohne gleich erschlagen zu werden von den ganzen Räumen. Die Räume sind eher knapp beschrieben, hat sie erzählt. Sie wollte auch den Spielern keine falschen Hinweise geben, keine Red Herrings im Spiel haben und dem Spieler klare Fokusobjekte an die Hand geben, mit denen er dann interagieren kann. Wir haben natürlich gefragt, warum der Spieler hungrig werden muss. Das war ja ein Element, das uns sehr erschreckt hat am Anfang. Und sie meinte, naja, das sei schon eine Parodie gewesen auf alte Interactive-Fiction-Spiele, in denen halt Spieler sterben, wenn sie nicht rechtzeitig essen. Und sie hatte im Studium selber mal das, was man Food Insecurity nennt, also eine Zeit lang, wo sie nicht genau wusste, wie sie das Essen bezahlen soll oder sich nicht alles leisten konnte, was sie gerne gegessen hätte. Das könnte Einfluss gehabt haben auf das Spiel, aber sie hat das humorvoll brechen wollen. Das hat ein bisschen dazu geführt, dass manche Spieler den Pierre nicht mochten, weil der ständig übers Essen redet. Das war vielleicht ein bisschen viel. Dann haben wir ein bisschen über die Story gesprochen und da passiert ja viel Offstage, also außerhalb des eigentlichen Spiels. Man kriegt ja viel nur mit in Briefen und in Erzählungen, die nicht Teil der Spielhandlung sind. Das Spiel selber besteht ja im Wesentlichen aus dieser Exploration des Hauses und den Rätseln. Und sie hat generell die Interaktion mit NPCs hier total runtergefahren. Sie wollte halt andere Schwerpunkte setzen. Sie wollte ein Spiel haben mit starken Systemen und einer starken Mechanik. Sie hatte vorher diese Dialogspiele gemacht. Das wollte sie genau jetzt hier nicht machen. Das ist sozusagen ein Gegenentwurf dazu. Dann haben wir ein bisschen über die Feelies gesprochen, die Schriftstücke, die dem Spiel beiliegen. Das ist ja eine alte Infocom-Tradition, die sie auch wieder aufgegriffen hat. Dann hat sie uns erzählt, dass sie das Endfeelie, das ist ja ein Brief vom Vater, dass sie das als versiegelten Brief geplant hatte und dass das eine Hommage an Wishbringer sein soll, weil in Wishbringer gibt es nämlich auch einen versiegelten Brief, den man nicht öffnen darf, bis das Spiel einem das sagt, und das fand sie ganz super. Was uns besonders interessiert hat, ist, es gibt ja diesen kodierten Brief im Spiel, den man entschlüsseln muss, und der ist ja im Spiel auch ungeöffnet. Und wir haben uns gefragt, warum Marie den nicht geöffnet hat, warum sie das mit Bedeutung nicht erkannt hat, weil der ist ja dann durchaus relativ wesentlich. Da meinte sie, ja, das sei einfach so passiert der Marie. Es gab halt Stress, es gibt viele Objekte im Haus. Das sei plausibel, dass Marie das einfach übersehen hat. Das hat keine tiefere Bedeutung. Dann haben wir sie gefragt, wie Savoir-Faire für sie im Rückblick ist. Und sie meinte, das sei schon ein Spiel, das weniger häufig erwähnt wird oder auf das sie weniger häufig angesprochen wird als auf Galatea oder Counterfeit Monkey. Aber es sei sehr wichtig für ihre persönliche Entwicklung als Game Designerin gewesen, vor allem wegen der systematischen Textgenerierung bei komplexen Zuständen. Und viel von dem, was sie da gemacht hat, ist in spätere Projekte eingeflossen. So, das war die schnelle Zusammenfassung. Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören und bis zum nächsten Mal.